When possession is manifested, the obsessed goes into a trance and loses consciousness, leaving space for the evil spirit to speak, to agitate the person, to curse, to vomit nails, glass, or other objects, and to demonstrate Herculean strength. In brief, to take over. On this subject, Father Candido told me of a case of a young girl, an extremely thin and apparently weak demoniac who, during the exorcisms, had to be tied with leather straps and held firm, with difficulty, by four very energetic men. Well, she managed to break the straps with which they attempted to tie her, causing them much trouble until the end of the rite. It also happened to me, a decade ago. A very thin young girl, she could not have been more than 13 years old, accompanied by her mother and her mother's friends, received incredible strength from the devil during an exorcism. It took all 7 of my guardian angels, the persons who accompany me with prayer, to hold her firm. During these crises, the manifestation of abnormal phenomena occurs at intervals, but not continuously. The subject will lose consciousness all of a sudden, but at other moments of the day, the subject will appear normal. The possession is seldom permanent. More often, the crises are provoked by external motives, for example, during a situation of spiritual stress, such as the exorcism itself, the Mass, benediction, prayer, or even the simple introduction of a sacred object. At other times, it goes off without apparent cause. The demon acts when, how, and where he wishes, during the day, at night, or even in public situations, so that all can see. In these cases, its will is acting through the spiritual power of its angelic nature. Nothing in these cases is ascribable to the victim of the possession. Father Gabriele Amorth, An Exorcist Explains the Demonic, translated from the Italian.
Every culture has its ghosts, its legends, its mysteries.
From UFOs to haunted houses, psychic visions to cryptids, we explore the stories that defy explanation and what they reveal about what it means to be human.
I'm Chris Daly.
And I'm Ryan Geckner. We're anthropologists asking big questions about belief, experience, and the unknown.
This is Beyond the Human. So welcome back, everybody. We're glad to be back. It's been a rough semester, and the end of semester is always a tough time. Always takes a lot of our energy and efforts, which, those of you who live in the real world, the normal world outside of academia, probably don't have to deal with
Probably
that.
are like, get over it.
Yeah. So we're glad to be back, and hopefully you'll be hearing more from us throughout the summer.
Yes, definitely.
So today we're going to talk a little bit about exorcism, but specifically different types of exorcism. So from the anthropological perspective or the cross-cultural perspective, we're going to take a look at this, and we will absolutely talk about the Catholic version that everyone knows about, but we have some others that we'd like to discuss as well.
Yep.
So let's just start off with exorcism from an anthropological perspective.
Yep.
And that goes beyond just cross-cultural. Yes,
Yeah.
of course, we all
Yeah.
do cross-cultural, but
Yep.
What is it? From the medical anthropology standpoint, and Ryan can jump in and talk about more cultural, we view it as just a spiritual healing. And if you look cross-culturally, I'm saying culture a lot, aren't I?
Yeah.
Cross-culturally, a lot of cultures do recognize that spiritual healing is a part of healing. In fact, allopathic medicine or biomedicine, your typical MDs, we're some of the few people who don't recognize spiritual healing and try to separate that out, which is an interesting thing in and of itself.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, globally, we are, I think we've said this elsewhere on the podcast, we are kind of weird in that we do that we keep spiritual healing siloed away from the rest of our approaches to medicine and illness.
Exorcism is a type of that spiritual healing. And it's part of what most people term the folk sector of healthcare. So the folk sector of healthcare is outside of that really standardized, regulated type of sector. And I will say that most exorcism is a part of that sector, but I would actually put Catholicism into the professional sector. And here's why. So if you look at the professional sector of healthcare, there's certain characteristics that define it. The first is that there is an organized training, not an apprenticeship training, but an organized training based on an organized body of knowledge. So you go somewhere and you learn the thing. There are very structured relationships among all the different people within the profession. They are regulated, they are credentialed, and they are guided by various professional organizations. And I would argue that Catholic exorcists actually fit into
Definitely in
this.
Catholic and
Yeah,
tradition, yeah.
super regulated,
Hmm.
definitely credentialed. You can't just be an exorcist, and you can't even just be a priest and be considered an exorcist. It's additional training, it's very formalized. And there is a professional organization outside of just the Catholic Church that regulates it,
Hmm.
and that is the International Order of Exorcists. So I definitely put that in there. If you look at exorcism in a lot of other cultures, I would definitely put that in the
Hmm.
folk section, and that is an apprenticeship training. And it's still something that's done by a select group of people within a particular culture, but it lacks those defining characteristics of the professional sector.
Yeah.
It lacks the structure.
Yeah.
So from a medical anthropology perspective, that's kind of where we
Yeah.
place
Yeah.
exorcism. So when we look at what exorcism treats, we think about it as treating what we call personalistic illnesses. So in anthropology, we separate things into naturalistic and personalistic illnesses. Naturalistic are illnesses that are caused by sort of impersonal things in nature. These are the things that you would typically see treated in allopathic medicine, but also in acupuncture, Ayurvedic medicine, herbal
Hmm.
medicine,
Hmm.
all of those formalized systems. But the key here is that the naturalistic illnesses are caused by things like organic breakdown or deterioration, obstruction, injury, an imbalance of some kind, malnutrition, parasites, all of those kinds of things. Those are naturalistic things in nature
Hmm.
are causing
Hantavirus, for example.
hantavirus, for example, on cruise ships.
Yes, on cruise ships. Don't go on cruise ships, guys. You're getting norovirus or Hanta. You're not having a
Maybe
great time.
both. I
Or
mean,
both. That would be horrible.
it really
That would
would.
be
Um,
on so many levels.
So exorcism is not used to treat those
Right.
kinds of illnesses. It's used to treat personalistic illnesses. Not all personalistic illnesses, but personalistic means that these are illnesses that are due to the acts or wishes of individuals or supernatural beings or forces. Therefore, the cure has to be in that same realm. So possession is definitely one of those, but it can also be something like the intrusion of an object into the body by supernatural means, or a
Hmm.
curse or hex. Things like that are also part of that personalistic realm. So exorcism is used to treat possession, but if you look at possession itself, it can actually be caused by multiple things.
Yeah.
And so in some cases, exorcism is used to treat a curse because it involved the possession of somebody because of that curse.
Yeah, we'll talk about a couple different examples. If you're familiar at all with the evil eye, that's a common reason for someone to look for an exorcism in some contexts for sure. Now, from a cultural perspective, one thing I wanted to point out here that's really kind of an important distinction is we're not, when we talk about spirit possession from the perspective of cultural anthropology, we're talking about two very different things. So, on the one hand, we have exorcism, which you're probably familiar with, and if you're not, by the end of this episode, you will be. These are practices that are with the purpose of evicting malevolent spirits from a person or an area that's believed to be possessed. And so these individuals are being possessed by all kinds of different types of spirits. Some characteristics maybe are shared across cultures. I think we're going to kind of get into that a little bit here. But that is definitely not the only example that we see around the world of spirit possession or spirits taking control of living people. So, on the other hand, we have what's called adoricism. These are practices that are used to placate and accommodate spiritual entities in a possessed person or a place. So in contrast to exorcism, we're talking about individuals are being possessed, but we have a particular set of rituals and practices that we're using to accommodate that spirit. Now, you may think, what, that doesn't even make sense. Why would you ever do that? Well, a couple of good examples are, from Haitian voodoo. So the Loa will possess a person who is at a ceremony and communicate to the people there about all kinds of different things, and then will leave the person's body at the end of the ceremony. And so you can see we'll link some stuff in the show notes. There's a really good documentary. It's kind of old, but it's good in that it shows actual ceremonies and actual voodoo possessions. It's called The Divine Horseman by Maya Deren. And that's an example of the Loa, who are these spirit beings that are akin to gods and goddesses in the way that you would kind of think about them generally. And they are possessing individuals for a period of time. On the same sort of token, in Bali, there's a tradition of trance mediumship, where individuals will go to mediums who will fall into a trance and will be possessed by a variety of different spirits. These are examples that are very different from what we're going to talk about today, because those are, more positive experiences, interactions that are not happening because someone cursed you. They're happening because you performed a ritual in a particular way.
So it's a purposeful
Yeah, exactly.
interaction with
Yes. Yes.
those beings.
Yeah. Now, I think it's important for us on that note to talk about what counts as possession, and what doesn't, right? So we're not even going to really get into the nitty gritty of spirit possession versus altered states of consciousness, mainly because Chris wants to really dig into that at some point, because that's
There's a lot of work with
yes.
altered states of consciousness, and I really want to have some full
And then,
episodes.
yeah, we owe that to you, the listener, an actual full deep dive. So we're not going to get into that nitty gritty here, but I did think it was worth pointing out that even though we just said that Western medicine doesn't really deal with possession, we do have a definition in the DSM.
Well, we do with possession what we do
Yes.
with many
Yes.
different things that we don't understand.
Yes.
And that means we put them into mental health.
Yes.
And we put them into the DSM, which is the
Mhm.
Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which,
Five.
oh yes, we're in 5. And and that lists out, what all of the different possible mental health diagnoses
Everything
are.
from generalized anxiety all the way up to possession and trance disorder.
Well, and I have to just talk for a moment about the DSM. It changes. This is version 5, and it changes pretty dramatically. And like I said, we tend to put anything in there that we don't understand or that we don't like.
Yep.
Up until not that long ago, homosexuality was in there.
I am pretty sure that was in the 4.
I think it was in the
Yeah.
4. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yep.
we put whatever in there. And so
Kind of a catch-all.
It really is. And so I think that's just an important thing to understand about the DSM and how that works.
Yeah. And so, with that said, possession and trance disorder is listed in the DSM, and I'm just going to walk us through kind of how it's defined in there.
And it's a long definition.
It's a very long definition, so buckle in, folks. First and foremost, it's understood primarily as a type of dissociative disorder. So there is no evidence of physical disorder that explains the symptoms, and that there are convincing associations between the symptoms of the disorder and stressful events, problems, or needs. Okay, so you have this experience that you're having, and then at the same time, your psychiatrist or psychologist can draw associations between those symptoms and things happening in your life. Now, I feel like, having just read that and explained that, that explains like 99% of what's in the DSM, right? Like,
yes.
Oh, you have generalized anxiety disorder. Well, yeah, you have these symptoms and they're associated with your anxiety. So, like, there we go.
And that makes perfect sense for a mental health issue.
It does. It does. It does. But it just seems awfully convenient. Now, to rise to the definition or the diagnosis of a possession and trance disorder, you have to have either one of two things. So first, you have to have a trance, which is a temporary altered state of consciousness. Now, again, that's the psychologist definitions. We're not even going to get into that.
Oh, consciousness is just a fun discussion.
Yeah, we're just not going to get into that today. Which is shown by any two of the following. So first, loss of usual sense of personal identity, or a narrowing of awareness of immediate surroundings, or unusually narrow and selective focus on environmental stimuli, or a limitation of movements, postures, and speech to repetition of a small repertoire. You either have that, or you have the possession disorder, which is defined as a conviction that the individual has been taken over by a spirit, power, deity, or other person. And so you can see that definition is very broad and kind of encompasses the two things that I decided to separate out, or said we needed to separate.
And notice that it says the conviction.
Yes.
That the individual.
Yes. Now, the other thing, this is where it gets where they're kind of giving us a nod. They're giving the anthropologists a subtle nod here, is that the trance or possession has to be unwanted or troublesome, occurring outside or being a prolongation of similar states in religious or other culturally accepted situations. So hopefully psychologists wouldn't be going around to voodoo ceremonies and diagnosing people with possession disorder, because that is the context in which that's supposed to happen and is the goal of those ceremonies. Now, the most commonly used exclusion criteria is that none of those things that I just described occur at the same time as schizophrenia or related disorders or mood disorders with hallucinations or delusions. Most often, psychologists and psychiatrists aren't diagnosing someone with trance or possession disorder because they probably have one of those other diagnoses.
Right. And I would think that that's probably changed over time as well.
Yeah, oh, definitely, definitely.
Um, but yeah, I mean, there's so many different possible psychiatric
Yeah,
diagnoses out there, that to ultimately wind up at possession disorder, I think you'd have to go through a lot of others and
yeah,
make sure that they're not there. So
yeah. And so I'm not even going to dig into kind of the nitty gritty of the diagnostic criteria for possession trance disorder. Just I think it's important to know that a lot of times this is also diagnosed as dissociative identity disorder. This is what we formerly called multiple personality disorder. This is basically just a condition where you have two or more separate personalities that control your behavior at different times. And so when personalities switch, you'll have gaps in memory. Identities are usually caused by living through trauma. And so you can see where if you have a very strict sort of psychological or traditionally allopathic medical approach, that you would easily filter someone into DID who has the things that we're going to talk about.
and DID is also not a super common
Right.
diagnosis. This is not, and in fact, there are actually some people who really don't think that it's a real thing.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
but if you do buy into DID and really look at people who have this disorder and have been diagnosed with it, not just say they do. I mean, so have gone through the formal diagnosis process, they really have very different personalities. I
Yeah.
mean, it is fascinating to read about in and of itself, but they don't have certain criteria that are used by spiritual healers
Right.
to diagnose someone with possession.
Mm-hmm.
These different personalities are different personalities. In fact, there have been a couple cases where like one personality will have diabetes and another won't. So there are physical things
Yeah,
going on too. It's wild.
that's wild. The
Um,
body is scary, folks.
yeah, it really is. But you're not going to hear about, things like this extraordinary strength, speaking in tongues, preternatural, all of
I was gonna
that.
say, yeah, I was gonna
So
ask about the preternatural knowledge. Yeah.
yeah. So, but really an interesting diagnosis, one I really would not want to have. But
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
yeah.
All right, so when we were putting this episode together, we knew we wanted to talk about exorcism, but we also knew that we didn't want to approach it solely from the Catholic perspective. Partly because that's like what everyone thinks they know, thanks to The Exorcist and the rest of the Hollywood movies.
Great
But
movie.
yeah, yeah, great movie, great movie. Yeah, don't get me wrong, yeah, great movie. But at the same time, we wanted to like show that this tradition or that this practice is something that we see globally in a lot of contexts, and that there are differences but also a lot of similarities. Like I think that's the thing that really stuck with me after researching this episode was, there's a lot more similarities in this than I expected.
And I think some of the similarities have to do with the historical context.
Some of it, for
Some of these
sure.
are drawing from the same
For sure. For sure.
roots historically, and I'm talking, 2,500 years
Yeah.
ago
Yeah.
kind of roots.
These are some deep roots.
Yeah.
Yeah. So let's just jump into that. So we decided we would start with exorcism in the Muslim tradition. So the term for an exorcism is a ruqya. Now I'm gonna apologize up front for all of my Arabic pronunciations. I took 5 years of Spanish and 1 year of Japanese, so I can't help you with most of these. So if they're wrong, my apologies. Please correct me. So the way we decided to break this down is to kind of approach it from that medical anthro perspective of causes, diagnosis, and treatment, which I think is a little bit different than most people think about exorcism. So, when we're talking about it from the Muslim tradition, one of the principal causes are jinn. Now, you may be somewhat familiar with jinn or genies, and these are kind of corollaries to demonic beings from a Christian perspective or a Jewish perspective, but also kind of not. So, in Islam, jinn are one of what are called the three rational beings created by Allah, the others being humans and angels. Now, these jinn can be good or bad, and there is some sort of hand-wringing and argument about whether or not they are actually beyond those distinctions. What I was reading kind of made them seem a little trickstery in a way. So,
Well, I mean, we as humans like to dichotomize things.
yeah,
We
we
like
do.
to say
Yes.
good, bad, but there's a lot of in between. And I think a lot of beings outside of humanity fall into that
Yeah.
range of somewhere in there. They can be good, they can be bad.
Yeah. And so, in addition to being good or bad, they also sort of reflect the plurality of the world, which is really a unique approach in terms of religion. So Islam is very pluralistic, I think, in ways that many people do not understand or appreciate. Mostly because of the way that most people in the United States and most parts of the Western world are told about Islam and sort of consume media about Islam. It seems very sort of closed off and exclusive and, not overly open to other opinions. But that's actually not true in a lot of contexts. This is true of the jinn as well. So they can be young, they can be old, male, female, they can be different ethnicities, they can speak different languages. They can also be both Islamic or infidel. So they can be a jinn who is practicing another religion. And this oftentimes determines how the exorcist will deal with those spirits. So if the jinn is Muslim, they are bound to Sharia law and can be convinced that what they're doing is wrong. Or the jinn, if they're not Muslim, are essentially converted to Islam throughout the process of the exorcism, which I find interesting.
This is the most interesting part
Yeah.
of the Muslim perspective on this to me. You know, just the idea that you can say to a jinn like, "Hey, you're Muslim. You're
What are you
not being a
doing,
good."
man? Yeah, what are you
I
doing?
think that's phenomenal. I love
Hmm.
that perspective.
Yeah.
And you don't see that elsewhere.
No, no, you really don't. Within the jinn, you have a class of what are described as evil jinn called the shayateen. And if you look, some sources will point to this as the sort of source, the Christian source for the spirit Satan. And these are considered to be masters of deception. They're extremely strong. They're clever. And these jinn in particular often live in places that humans don't like. So bathrooms, garbage dumps, abandoned buildings, etc. There's also, I'm not really going to get into it too much, but there is an association between jinn and liminal spaces. So, and there's a lot of discussion and belief around jinn and doorways and thresholds and things like that, that are also kind of seen as these in-between places, which in some sense, these places that humans don't like to go are also in between in a sense.
And that's all very similar across a lot of cultures. The idea that, in this case, evil jinn, or you can look at them as demons, or, these are beings that are in places that humans don't often go.
Right. And so, in addition to jinn, the other kind of main causes of possession are moments of intense emotion. So, fright, anger, fury, even joy. And I kind of wondered, I didn't really find much about this in my research, but I was wondering if some of that is like attracting these spirits in a way, because I think I've heard people talk about that in other contexts too. Also, witchcraft or sihir, which is oftentimes associated with the evil eye. And so that can be, something that can cause you to be possessed. And last, Allah's will. So there is this perspective among Muslims, and I think this is similar in Catholicism too, is that everything happens according to divine will. And so if a possession is happening, it was allowed to happen by Allah, and how you interpret that, whether it's a test of your faith or whatever, is kind of up to you. And then at the same time, deliverance then happens by his hands as well. And that I think is something that's pretty common in the Abrahamic traditions in particular, because they like to talk about Sky Daddy being in charge of everything. So, now, moving on to diagnosis, right? So, how do you know? I mean, some of these, you might know that you've been witched or you've had the evil eye on you, but you may not necessarily know. And so, some of the things that Muslims will look for to determine whether or not, or to, assume that maybe they've been possessed, are a series of misfortunes, bad luck, chaos in their lives. Apparently, no one has toddlers. Undiagnosable or untreatable health problems might make someone think that they've been possessed. One of the things that a lot of Muslim exorcists talk about is this idea that possessed individuals often will have visions or dreams that are related to their possession. And these are in part interpreted by the exorcist. Now, I want to take just like a quick sidebar about who the exorcists are in this tradition. So we have, if you're familiar at all with Islam, you have imams. So these are typically your like mosque leaders. They have formal theological training. They're your preachers and pastors and priests. And then there is another class of sort of religious leader called the mullah. And these are sort of more local. They're less formally trained. It's also a lot more common in Central Asia to find folks like this. These are kind of elders who have some religious training and may have specific training in deliverance ministry. Okay, to go back to these dreams, right? So a lot of times you'll hear folks talk about having dreams that are related to the possession, and particularly you'll hear people talk about how these change over the course of treatment, and that's kind of how they point to this association, right? And so one of the articles that I came across that talked about this, I'm just going to read a quick quote from it. It said, quote, "One woman told me that when the mullah first read the Quran to her, she saw a woman with three young children and an elderly man. She decided that a whole family is probably sitting there. The second time, the woman in the vision was shouting and swearing, like how a witch behaves, according to the description of the patient. But as time passed, this dream woman became more submissive, asked not to be beaten or attacked, and promised to leave." And so that was seen as or interpreted as a sign that the exorcism was successful or that it was working, right? So in addition to weird dreams and also, bad luck, undiagnosable health problems, and untreatable health problems, that in particular is something that people point to a lot, is this manifestation of physical ailments in addition to sort of spiritual ailments and possession. One thing in Islam that I found particularly cool, I thought, was how much emphasis there is on receiving separate allopathic treatment for the stuff that's going on in addition to your possession. And so that's just built into the thing. When you're going through this process of having an exorcist identify that you have a possession, one of the things that they'll do is they'll send you and say like, "Hey, go deal with all of the physical things that are happening with you. I can't deal with that. I'll deal with the spiritual stuff." And there's a really, really good documentary that is really hard to get a hold of, which is really annoying. It's called Living with the Invisibles. It's an ethnographic look at sort of how North African migrants in, I forget where in Europe, it's either Denmark or the Netherlands, one of those, are receiving treatment and experiencing things like possession, and how they're being received by the medical community there. And it's very interesting. It kind of deals with some of that stuff. So if you can get a hold of a copy of it, I highly recommend it. So one of the most straightforward ways to diagnose is actually just to read Quranic verses associated with the Ruqya, which Ruqya is the Arabic word for exorcism, and observe patients' responses, which hold on to that because we're going to talk about that in a minute with Catholicism too. Oftentimes, the possessed patients will often behave inappropriately. They'll growl, they'll scream, they'll fight back. They'll do the very stereotypical stuff you expect, the full Regan exorcist pea soup, and all of that. Now that we know that we're possessed, well, how do we get treated, right? So in the Muslim tradition, exorcists will follow a basic guideline, but there is a little bit of variety. So apart from that, they all include the use of Quranic verses. And so what the term for this is Ruqya Sharia, which is the practice of treating illness through reading Quranic ayat. These are verses. Particularly, they read the Ayah al-Kursi, which is considered the most effective against jinn, which is linked in the show notes where you can read and hear it. I think it's really important that you hear it. Specifically with Islam, first of all, listening to the Quran be read. It's very melodic. It's an experience. Also, you'll hear folks in Islam talk about the importance of actually hearing the word. So I highly recommend go listen to it. It'll give you kind of a sense, and it also has a translation with it as well. Now, like I said before, there's something of a kind of negotiation that happens sometime with the jinn. And the exorcist will convince the jinn to leave the patient and then convert to Islam.
All right, so let's take a bit of a dive into the Catholic healing ministry or deliverance and exorcism. To start this off, I just want to give full disclosure on myself. I am a practicing Catholic, and I've been a part of deliverance and healing ministry for quite a while, well over 10 years. I was trained at the Pope Leo the 13th Institute at Mundelein, and for 3 years, 3 summers. And so much of what I'm going to talk about comes from there and also from personal experience. So yeah, I just wanted to put that in there as disclosure.
Yeah, no, that's good.
Since we're all disclosing things now.
Yeah, that's right. I'm not a practicing Catholic, so.
I want to start with a little bit of history because this is going to tie it to some of the other things we're going to talk about. So the Catholic healing ministry has roots in a lot of other ancient faiths, and everyone immediately says, well, Judaism, obviously. Well, yes, Jesus was Jewish, so that shouldn't be a shock to anybody.
Duh.
Yes, there's ties to Judaism. But if you look very carefully at the full history, this particular part of the Catholic faith has ties to ancient Egyptian, Canaanite, Assyrian, Babylonian, Zoroastrian, and Greek traditions. And all of those are considered precursors to and contributing to the Catholic rite of exorcism. So that was actually shocking to me.
Yeah,
I didn't realize that when I started taking a deeper dive into the history. So this is not something that originated with Christ. This is something that goes back a lot further. And so that's why I think we see so many ties to some of these other traditions.
Also, maybe explains why everyone assumes that when you need an exorcist, you call a Catholic.
You call a Catholic, yeah. Because we just borrowed from everybody.
Looks like you got the resume, so we'll just go with y'all.
Yeah. So some of the basis for exorcism actually comes from the Jewish Apocrypha. And there's a couple of books I want to point to in there. And the first is the Book of Tobit, and this was written in the 2nd century BCE. So this is not a new book.
That's all.
So the main character by the name of Tobias is instructed by the archangel Raphael to use incense and some other things to expel a demon, specifically Asmodeus, from Sarah. And so there's a description in here of that exorcism occurring. Around the same time, the Book of Jubilees was also written, and you see some interesting things about exorcism in there as well. This particular book provides a nice long history of angels and demons and information about their influence on people. It also talks about remedies. So we start to see them talking about binding spirits through God at Noah's request, through prayer. And it also goes into a bunch of different protective measures against demons and their influence. So not just exorcism, but protective measures. And I didn't realize that some of those protective measures went back quite that far either. Again, mid-2nd century BCE. The other ancient text that I'd like to talk a little bit about is the Qumran Scrolls, which many people know as the Dead Sea Scrolls. These were written about 130 BCE to 50 CE, and they include a lot of information on Jewish exorcism.
So much cool stuff in the Qumran Scroll.
It's
a lot of cool stuff in it.
Really interesting. And so there's one particular text that is a commentary on Genesis. It's called the Genesis Apocryphon. And it includes an account of an exorcism that was effective after 2 years of physicians and magicians attempting to cure. Though if you read through it, it doesn't seem to be a full possession. It seems to be more of an obsession, but we'll get into semantic in a minute. Yeah. So that's interesting to me that, back then, so we're talking a couple thousand years ago, there was discussion of, hey, we had our physical healers trying to do something about this thing, and it wasn't working.
Yeah. Well, and I think what's cool about that too is we have an assumption a lot of times that people that long ago didn't differentiate those two things. Even though I know I just said we are weird and that we do, but they were trying to use both at the same time, and those were different guys. And so I think that's pretty cool that we have evidence of that.
Yeah, so I wanted to touch a little bit on that history because again, everybody thinks that everything sort of in Catholicism starts with Christ, and not really.
And I wonder too, well, yeah, true. And I wonder, like, I know in Catholicism, there's a very structured and explicit system of demonology and angelology in a way that we don't see always in other traditions. And I wonder if some of that comes from this history, if
Definitely.
there's like overlap with, Canaanite beings and Assyrian
Yeah.
beings and stuff that's in there.
I think there's definitely that, and definitely to Judaism.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
So fast forward, actually we're about the same time frame,
Yeah,
but
almost. Yeah.
but let's talk about the starting of Christianity. And of course, you have to go to the Gospels to kind of talk through that. And so, if you look at the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, they make it very, very clear that Christ was a teacher, a healer, and an exorcist.
Hmm.
And healer and exorcist are two different things, and that's important.
Hmm.
So throughout these gospels, it becomes pretty clear that Jesus is differentiating between people in need of physical healing and those in need of exorcism, but he performs both. If you look at all of the accounts of these things, way more often it's physical healing.
Yeah,
Way more
Yeah.
often. And when you're dealing with physical healing, you're dealing with laying on of hands too. But there are some, examples of exorcism, and this differentiation is made even in today's exorcism, that, spiritual healing through deliverance and exorcism is a different thing than physical healing.
Hmm.
So the important piece about Jesus performing exorcism was that his technique was different from the other Jewish exorcists of the time. So there were other Jewish exorcists walking around doing their thing. But Jesus was the first to use first person when commanding the demon. And so this is one of the things that Christians point to as showing divinity.
Hmm.
So other exorcists would call on Yahweh to
Hmm.
perform the exorcism, and Jesus said, I command
Hmm.
in terms of the demon. So he would begin by addressing the demon according to its manifestation. Then he would bind it through his own personal authority and command. He would then direct the demon to depart and never enter again, which would not require the use of an amulet or talisman. Now, other exorcists, again, at the time, Jewish exorcists, were bringing out amulets and talismans to give people to say, hey, this is going to help make sure that demon doesn't come back.
Hmm.
And Jesus didn't do that. So this is where he starts departing from Jewish exorcism. And by the way, there is still Jewish exorcism.
Hmm.
All right, so now let's talk a little bit about what's going on today.
Hmm.
Again, I think history is important, though.
Yes, it is.
But I want to talk about deliverance and exorcism because they are different.
Hmm.
And so,
Yeah, and I think this is particular to the Catholic context, right? Because I grew up Protestant, so when we talk about it, we don't talk about exorcism, we just talk about deliverance. But then if you look at deliverance ministry from a Protestant perspective, it's like these big tent revivals where people are having exorcisms happen like in the front of the church. So I think that
you
that
guys take
distinction.
exorcism to a new level.
I mean, do we though? I think it's kind of weak, honestly, just because, I mean, maybe this is like,
In terms of the numbers of people involved in
well, yeah, okay,
this
yeah, that's
surrounding it
fair. I mean,
is
I
very
think,
different.
well,
Okay.
yes, I mean, I think that's a particularly, not to get too religious studies on everyone, but that's a particular facet of American evangelical Christianity that is special. We'll call it special. Um, but there's like not a really structured system around it.
Yeah.
It's very loosey-goosey. It's very individualized in terms of, when you go from like pastor to pastor. And so I think it's important to note that here too. But yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Because we didn't really throw in much Protestant
Because
Christianity.
it would be weird to talk about it, honestly. Like it would be really hard to like nail it down so succinctly and
Yeah.
like so
Yeah.
clearly because it's so loose. But yeah.
All right. So to get into what exorcism is, I first want to make the point that it is a sacramental, not a sacrament. So
What's the difference
what
there,
does
Chris?
that mean?
I would love to know.
Okay. So sacraments are the seven outward signs instituted by Christ to confer grace directly. What that means is baptism, confirmation, Eucharist, penance, anointing of the sick, holy orders, and matrimony. There are seven formalized things that Catholics do, or
It is the checklist.
it is. So these work by the action themselves, and they are performed by someone ordained by the church, with some exceptions. And, I don't know if anybody knows this, but anybody, even a non-Catholic, can baptize in an emergency.
How does that work though, if you're not Catholic?
I guess you have to know the words. I don't.
Yeah, because right, because that's why I was asking, because like there's a
Yeah.
very particular, I mean,
Yeah.
I guess you could Google it,
Well,
but
this is
let me just pull this up on my phone real quick. Boo, I got you.
well, it's talking about emergency
Right,
situations, like let's say a child is born and is about to die
right,
and you
right.
want to baptize and so it's less important at that point for it to be the real formal
Okay, okay,
structured thing.
interesting. All right.
Okay, so those are sacraments. Sacramentals, on the other hand, are holy objects or actions instituted by the church to prepare people to receive grace and to sort of sanctify and help in daily living. So they just depend on the user's disposition and the church's prayer. So they lead people towards holy living
Hmm.
based on what the person is doing and the prayer that they use. These are things like blessings, rosaries, sprinkling holy water, or holy water itself is actually a sacramental. When people genuflect, all of that kind of stuff. These are all sacramentals.
Do relics fall in that too?
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
So exorcisms of all kinds are sacramentals.
Okay,
Sacramentals, interestingly, are not mandated to be performed by someone ordained by the church,
okay.
which, if you think about it, makes a
That
lot
makes
of
sense.
sense. I mean, anybody can say a rosary, right?
Right, yeah, yeah. Anybody can
Um,
sprinkle holy water. Yeah, yeah. Okay.
However, it's an interesting blend though, because like,
Feels like
well,
it's in a gray area between the two.
it is a gray area, and so are some of these other sacramentals. Like holy water itself can be used by anyone, but the
Yeah,
blessings that are done over it are done
yeah.
by someone who's ordained. So a little bit weird.
Hmm.
Um, Exorcism falls into a very odd space, and the history of it is even more strange. In fact, in the past, lots of people could do exorcisms, didn't even have to be a priest. There was also a time period where you had to be in the order of exorcists defined by the church, and that was the earlier order of
Hmm.
exorcists. Then that was removed, and it was for other priests. There's just a whole history here,
Hmm.
and we'll link to the show notes a fantastic, it's actually a dissertation. So yes, I read other people's dissertations in my free time. That's awful.
That's how much we care about you listeners.
But it's a dissertation that was done by a guy by the name of Jeffrey Grobe, and he is now the Archbishop of Milwaukee.
So kind of a big deal.
Yeah, so and he's an exorcist as well. So he did this nice deep dive into the history of all of it, and fascinating reading if you're into that kind of thing. Anyway. So let's talk about these things themselves. So, deliverance, also called minor exorcism, though I've heard people differentiate them too,
Hmm.
semantics.
Hmm.
This is a prayer for liberation from demonic oppression or influence, but not possession. So, you may hear this called a simple exorcism, a common exorcism. There's lots of words for it.
Your generic off-brand exorcism.
uh,
It's your great value exorcism.
but when we talk about deliverance, one of the ones, or when we talk, usually it's called simple exorcism at this point, but in baptism, there are two prayers of deliverance. You can also actually look at the Our Father. There's a whole, deliverance
That's
in
true.
there.
Yeah.
Deliver us.
Yeah. Yeah. Deliver us. Yeah.
Um, if you look at the prayer to Saint Michael the Archangel,
Hmm.
which is used in every Catholic Mass, it wasn't for a while, it came back, but it's back. That's actually a deliverance prayer. So there's a lot of deliverance, minor exorcism going on in the Catholic Church.
Very covert
It
too.
really is.
Like
People
real
don't know
covert.
about it.
Yeah.
Like if you ask the average Catholic who just went to Mass, hey, you know that prayer to Saint Michael? Yeah, we said it. I have it memorized.
Hmm.
What is it? What kind of
Hmm.
prayer? What is it
Yeah.
asking for? And people think, and they have to really think through that. So I find that really odd that we've really relegated deliverance to this sort of thing we don't talk about, but we still do it.
Hmm.
Now,
Honestly, I don't know though. I mean, maybe I'll put on my fake Catholic hat for a second. I mean, maybe that's like the point, right? Is like we're gonna slide this in there because Catholics take all this stuff real serious. So it's like, oh, we gotta make sure that everybody's not, getting messed around with by demons. So we'll just slide these little deliverance prayers into basically everything we do, and hopefully everybody be covered. So maybe that's what it
Maybe
is.
it is. Maybe it is. And you're sort of adopted Catholic. You're
Sure,
my
sure.
kid's
I hang around.
godfather. So
Yeah, that's right. That's true. Yeah, that's true. We did the whole Catholic thing. That's right.
there you go.
You're right. You're right. I held the candle and did all this stuff. That's right.
There
We
you
did.
go. So all of these different deliverance prayers can actually be used for personal prayer as well, and many people do use them, and they can be done by anyone. But the church does train people specifically in how to do a lot of this, and that includes laity, and that's some of the training that I went through. But these kinds of prayers are about protection and healing, but not exorcism. There's no command of a demon. It's not about expelling a demon. None of that. Deliverance and minor exorcism is strengthened, however, by the use of the sacraments, those seven things, and most particularly penance and the Eucharist, because those are the things you would be doing more often. You're not getting married, every week.
Right. Hopefully not.
Hopefully not.
Well, not in the Catholic tradition because getting divorced is complicated. So
Because then you got to deal with annulment constantly.
that's a lot. Nobody has time for that.
Yeah. And so also just using sacramentals and invoking the name of Jesus. So deliverance and minor exorcism is almost a daily thing for many people, and sometimes they don't even realize that they're doing it. Okay, then we get to the one everyone thinks about. The major, or also called the solemn exorcism. This is what everyone thinks about when they think about Catholic exorcism. It's what's been portrayed in the movies, mostly incorrectly, but that's okay. And interestingly, the quote you read from Gabriele Amorth, he liked the fact that Hollywood was doing exorcisms in movies.
Of course he did.
He liked the movie The Exorcist.
Yeah. If you don't know who he is, he was the former exorcist for Rome. I mean, he was the dude.
He was the Pope's exorcist.
Yeah, he was the Pope's exorcist. We should put on Instagram a list of good Hollywood depictions of exorcism.
Yeah.
We should.
And
'Cause there's a couple we like.
We've talked about doing some episodes, talking about some of those exorcisms. So maybe we'll do that.
Yeah, we should do that.
So solemn rite. The purpose is to liberate what is deemed the energumen or possessed person from demonic possession.
Is that Latin?
I think it might actually have Spanish roots, believe it or not, which means Latin, really, right?
Spanish Catholics,
Yeah. So the solemn exorcism is really rare, and I mean truly rare.
It's borrowed from ecclesiastical Latin.
Oh, it's ecclesiastical
You
Latin.
heard it here, folks.
But there's a Spanish to it too.
Well, I mean, like you said,
it's Romance language,
cousins,
so whatever.
yeah.
Anyway, so solemn exorcism can only be performed by an exorcist and can only be performed with the permission of the local bishop or archbishop. Again, that very regulated and hierarchical and structured Catholic system.
So I want to back that up just for a second, because you, the Catholic, are like ragging on that authority piece. And I think it's really important. We're not talking, I didn't pull out my religious studies background on the Synoptic Gospels piece, but I do want to pull it out here because in Catholicism, I think this is one of the coolest things in Catholicism, even though it's the thing that everybody rags on, is like the structured authority from the top to the bottom. It's not just by accident.
Oh, no, not at all.
The whole structure of that authority is built on this idea of apostolic succession. And it's the idea that all of this power comes straight back. You can trace your priestly lineage all the way back to Jesus.
Yeah.
And so that's why there's those steps in this process, which is kind of legit, honestly. And that is the thing that I find that fascinating and super cool, even though everyone's like, oh, it's so patriarchal and all the authority. And
well, it is patriarchal.
It is patriarchal, but I think like the sort of theological reason for doing that, I find very interesting.
No, that is very interesting. But what is also interesting is that exorcism was not always part of that structure. Right. It was done sort of outside of it.
Yes.
And part of the reason that it was sort of reined back in and brought back to the church and to priests, etc., was because there were people out doing exorcisms and sort of taking advantage of people.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me.
No, it doesn't surprise me. This was a long time ago, but yeah, that doesn't surprise me at all. So in any case, definitely managed through that hierarchy and through the way the church does things. And so that's a reason to put it in that professional sector, just to go back to talking about that.
Is there like a is there an understanding that like if you were, say you have this rogue priest and they decide,
Rogue priests are not allowed.
okay, well, in this hypothetical
Okay.
situation, there is a rogue priest,
Okay.
which sounds like a really great band name. Um, if you
Actually
have,
makes me think of Jaws because you had the rogue shark.
oh yeah, okay, yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So say you have this rogue priest and he decides that he wants to do this exorcism without the authority, without the permission of the
Yeah,
bishop.
you can't do
Is
that.
there an assumption that like it won't work because you don't have that?
Depends who you talk to.
Okay.
I think the more of the assumption is the priest is, going to lose his ability to be a
He'll be
priest.
defrocked.
Yeah, because you don't do that. But the reason it wouldn't work is not just the prayers being said outside of bishop, but the way Catholicism views the devil and views how you deal with the devil is very legalistic.
Right, and that's
Yeah.
why I ask, right? Like if you don't have that signature,
Yeah.
then it's like, oh well, whatever, man. I don't
Yeah.
have to follow these rules now because
But there
you
are
didn't sign the
people,
contract.
there are people who absolutely do it outside of
Okay.
that, but there are many times people who are previous priests who
Oh,
left the
interesting.
church
Okay.
and are sort of doing their own thing now.
Rogue priest.
And so I guess they're not rogue priests. All right. But they're not going rogue while still within the
Rogue
church. They've left,
priests,
they've
perhaps?
left the church.
Rogue and defrocked.
All right. So when you're doing an exorcism, it can be of a person or a place. And I think that's something that we don't hear in every faith.
Mm-hmm.
That
Yeah.
that you can talk about exorcising a place. But Catholics do recognize that, and exorcisms are done on both people and places. So let's just talk, since we talked about it with um, Islam, let's talk about how we get to the point where we need an exorcism performed.
So, in a Catholic context, when we talk about the cause of possession, there's a really like nicely packaged set of reasons. And so these start with kind of this assumption that all humans, Catholic or otherwise, are being influenced by demonic forces in one way or another.
And demons are everywhere.
Yeah.
Literally everywhere.
Yeah. And so you have the sort of like normal, everyday sort of temptation that everyone's experiencing all of the time. And then you have all of this stuff that I'm about to list that leads to all the kinds of things that you expect when you hear about demonic possession. So we have this idea of infestation, which is activity that affects houses, dolls, for example,
Think
other
Annabelle.
material, yeah, Annabelle, depending on how you feel about that, other material things, as well as animals. I find it interesting but unsurprising that Catholics slide animals into this category. And it can be like tied to things that have been hexed or cursed objects, things like that. Then we have the idea of bondage, when a person's addicted or bound to something negative and can't give it up. So these are things like substance abuse, and can these ones also can very easily be mistaken for mental illness. And so I don't know how Catholics parse that out in that case. Like, how do you? Because that's something clearly that you need allopathic treatment for in some way, shape, or form, right?
Well, sort of. You don't always need allopathic treatment for something. I'm
Sure.
an addiction researcher by
Yeah,
day.
we should, yes.
So throw that.
Let's throw this down.
And actually, depending on what you're addicted to and
Yeah, I
the
guess I was
type,
thinking like extreme, like
you're thinking like heroin,
opioid addiction.
right?
Yeah, right. Exactly.
You take one of the addictions that I've done a lot of work in, nicotine.
Right.
In some cases, you're doing that cold turkey.
Okay.
A lot of times, a Catholic will view this as you do have a substance abuse problem, and there are ways to treat it, but you should also be treating your spirituality
Okay.
because that is influencing your abuse of that
That
substance.
makes sense. That makes sense. So next we have obsession, which is just obsessive or irrational thoughts, usually dark or negative, of which a person's unable to free themselves of. It can easily, again, be mistaken for mental illness and can sometimes lead to suicide. So really uplifting stuff here, folks. Next, we have subjugation, which is voluntary submission to a demon. So this is, people making a pact with the devil.
Your average blood pact.
Yeah, you're just, just your run of the mill.
Satanic panic.
Yeah, exactly, right. Then there is external affliction. This is where we start involving physical attacks. And correct me if I'm wrong here, this is where you start seeing things moving and, all the bed shaking and the whole nine, all of that stuff. Then we have oppression, which is just demonic harassment. And then last, but certainly not least, possession, where the demon takes over full control of a person physically, but not spiritually.
Correct. Okay, so how does someone come under the influence of a demon? How does someone run into all of these different things? Really, I mean, we can go back to it's God's will
Right.
as one.
Yeah.
That again ties cross-culturally.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a lot of different ways that someone can come under the influence. And I go back to the statement that demons are all around us. They're always trying to harm people. They're always trying to like get in there and make you do bad things. So anybody can come into the influence of a demon. It doesn't matter if you're a good Catholic, if you're a Catholic at all. It doesn't matter if you're a good or bad person. None of that really determines whether you're going to have a problem with the demon. And I think that's really important because people make these assumptions about someone. Like, well, what did you do?
Mm-hmm.
Probably nothing.
Right.
In fact, many times cases of demonic possession are sort of traced back to trauma that someone has experienced in their life, and that's when the demon is said to have entered that person. What's interesting to me about that is the potential to misdiagnose DID, dissociative identity disorder, because again, it's going back to trauma, and that's when a person has some of those breaks in DID. So that's that you see that kind of convoluted overlap. A demon can also be sent after someone. So think curses, hexes, anything like that. They can also be attached to a place or an object. So if you come in contact with that place or object or whatever, there you go. And sometimes there's just no reason. So, it's important to not think about people who are experiencing this again as bad people. So what do you do if you think this is going on in your world? You need a diagnosis. And as with exorcism itself, there's a procedure that you have to follow. So if someone believes that they need the help of an exorcist, they request that help through either their parish priest or they go straight to the diocese. They don't go directly to the exorcist. In fact, most people don't know who the exorcist is.
I was just going to say, isn't that like half the reason?
Yeah, most dioceses do not advertise. I mean, you can go online and you can find some exorcists, absolutely, and some of them, true Catholic exorcists. Some of them are, let's call it out, and saying like, "This is who I am. This is what I do."
Out of the vestment closet.
Yeah, but not. But not all of them are like that. So many times you don't even know who this person is. So you go through your parish priest. There is a ridiculous amount of paperwork. And this paperwork is both legal and sort of just church-related intake kinds of things. So
it's the paperwork you fill out when you go to the doctor's office.
it is. There's a consent.
Mm-hmm.
And it has to be signed. There is an absolute consent to doing so. It's very medicalized in that sense. You have this sort of treatment form, and the intake form is really a history. And it asks questions about your medical history too. So it's paperwork. Typically, what'll happen is someone from the exorcist's team will do the intake with you and kind of go through and ask you all of these different questions and, try to figure out what's going on. Interestingly, you do not have to be Catholic. You are more likely to be helped quickly if you are. Just, it's over the past decade or 2 decades or whatever, the number of people requesting exorcisms has gone up really dramatically. So in a lot of cases, these guys are, overrun by people trying to get exorcisms. And most of the time they are not actually possessed, but you still have to sort of do the intake and weed through people. So a lot of exorcists do kind of push that task off on someone on their team. And you are definitely more likely to be helped more quickly if you're a practicing Catholic. So once you hit diagnosis is done sometimes by the exorcist himself, sometimes by his team, and sometimes using some combination thereof. Initially, there are just prayers said over the person. And again, that history, lots and lots of questions and discussion. And the prayers that are said in the beginning, they're not even deliverance exorcism prayers. They're just sort of standard prayers, and you see how the person responds to them. But this is called religious provocation, and it has to be done really carefully. So once you get to the point where you really think this person might be possessed, the exorcist needs to be involved in making that final sort of like, yeah, they're they're possessed. Some people talk about actually doing an exorcism, and that's how you diagnose. That is really frowned upon, and it is outside of what the church wants and allows. But some people try to do that. Um, but it is a religious provocation, so you might use some deliverance prayers. Diagnosis also involves a mental health professional. Exorcists have a mental health professional on their team. Sometimes it's the same person, sometimes they get someone outside who sort of works with them, but they mandate actually that someone go through a mental health evaluation prior to any sort of exorcism taking place. So you go to the mental health professional, you may be diagnosed with something, you may get medication, you may be told you have to wait to do the exorcism for X number of months while we figure out your meds. So there's a whole sort of process in there with mental health, and that's important to recognize because a lot of people think, well, it's all just mental health.
Right.
It also often involves a physical health specialist if there are things going on, like, say, seizures or, so sometimes you have to involve an MD or similar. So diagnosis takes a while.
Yeah.
Once you kind of get to the point where you're doing the religious provocation and trying to figure things out, there are things that are looked for that are considered signs of possession. And there's really not that many of them. But speaking in tongues, and this is speaking in languages that you would have no reason to know. So it's not like, oh, I took French in high school. I'm just going to speak French.
I start throwing down some French.
It's suddenly you're speaking in Aramaic or, extraordinary strength. And when we talk about extraordinary strength, I'll just give you an example. We had a case at one point where we had a woman who threw 5 adult males off of her, like threw across the room. That's not normal. Preternatural knowledge. So knowing things that you shouldn't know. And, an example of that was working with a young woman who told me about things that happened to me in high school. And she wasn't alive when I was in high school. There was no way she would have known things. And it wasn't generalizations. It was really very specific. So it's really weird when someone starts doing that. Changes in physical appearance. And so not subtle changes, dramatic changes, change in eye color. I've watched people's eyes change from blue to green to brown and back. So it's not all the big dark black like you see in movies, but changes in that physical appearance. People can almost get a different face. They get a different look to themselves. And then manipulation of the environment. And we're talking about massive manipulation, seeing things thrown across the room where no one threw them. Big changes or manipulation of the temperature. We've seen temperature drops of, 20 degrees instantaneously. So big changes, big manipulation of the environment. These are the things that you look for. If you have someone who has dissociative identity disorder, they're not going to do these kinds of things. And so that's why you get that mental health professional involved, and you make sure that you're kind of covering all bases. So once you get through that, after the diagnosis is made, the exorcist provides the evidence to the bishop, and the bishop grants permission for it to take place. So you finally get to the actual treatment, the major rite of exorcism, or the Roman ritual. So a lot of people sort of mistakenly believe that exorcisms are done in exactly the same way every time you do them. They're not. And this is similar to what you were talking about in Islam. There are key components that have to be done. But there's also things that might send you in different directions that happen during the ritual itself. And so you may decide to, we're going to use this prayer this time, even though we haven't used it before. We're going to use this litany. We're going to use this Bible passage, and those things can change. So when you look at who is actually involved in the exorcism, obviously you have the exorcist. You typically have at least one additional priest or deacon, sometimes more. So another person who is ordained in some way. It's just good to have more than one. There's always a psychologist or other mental health professional. There's always a medical doctor or other physical health professional. Then you have people who perform intercessory prayer, and that can be done either in person or at a far site. And it's often done both. So often when an exorcism is going on, you have people praying in a far location. And just as an aside, there's some really fascinating literature on how people are helped through prayer, even if they don't know that they're being
Hmm.
prayed for. Really fascinating stuff. Yeah, so you may have people doing that. You may have other, and these are laity, you may have other people who have specific charisms. So
What's a
a
charism?
charism is a gift from the Holy Spirit. It's what makes you special.
Oh.
It's people's gifts, people's individual strengths, essentially. So some people are discerners and they can tell when a demon is present, sometimes what demon it is, sometimes when it leaves, and they seem to have knowledge of these things that most of us don't. There are people who have other types of knowledge. So sometimes you have folks who just are really well read and have some good knowledge on maybe what might be causing something because they're familiar with someone's cultural background, for example.
Hmm. Hmm.
We do have a lot of people involved in exorcism who are part of the charismatic movement in Catholicism. And this is a little bit Protestant-y, if that's a
It's a
word.
lot of bit Protestant. Its roots are in Protestantism.
Yeah. So these are folks who will do things like speak in tongues and they pray in tongues, and it's really weird to listen to me. Like,
That all has its roots in evangelical Christianity. So
yeah. So you do have Catholics who sort of embrace that aspect, and charismatics have gotten really involved in exorcism. You also have family members and close friends of the energumen present, usually at least one, sometimes more. But it's helpful to have someone there who that person really trusts, and so they're often present too. So this is a big group of people,
hmm.
really. I mean, it's not the lone exorcist.
Yeah.
There's lots of people involved. The exorcism is done at a church or other sort of sacred location if you're dealing with a person. If you're dealing with a place, obviously you go to that place and do it there. A lot of the prayers are the same. There are some differences when you're dealing with a place. So there's a few things that the exorcist and the laity involved do to prepare for the exorcism. They do a lot of prayer, a lot of going to church. They do penance, confession. A lot of times there's fasting involved, and they do a lot of research, trying to figure some things out. Within the exorcism itself, you use things like various prayer books. Obviously, you have the Roman ritual, the book, but you use the Bible, you use other prayer books, you use various sacramentals. There's always incense, holy water, salt, oil, all of those kinds of things. Bells are often used. They're usually blessed, but bells are often used. Obviously, crucifixes, relics are often present. So there's a lot of things involved in this, and I'm not going to go through any detail on that because I've already been talking for a while.
That's okay.
So exorcism is done through Jesus. Exorcism is not done like the priest isn't the one doing it. It's comes from it comes from a higher power. It's a conduit. He's a conduit. The other folks who are often called on for assistance are Saint Mary, Saint Michael the Archangel. They're pretty much both always involved. And if you look at Catholic teachings, Mary is a big part of them, which is different from Protestant faiths. And she is a huge part of exorcism and deliverance ministry, as is Saint Michael the Archangel. There's others, you really call on the help of all the saints, and it's a group effort, let's just say. So there are a series of prayers that are standard, and then you add others as you need to, you add readings, and you call on people on the team to do different things. The exorcist will control the setting and sort of say, you do this, whatever. So it might be that various people are saying specific prayers, or they're doing readings, or they're sometimes just talking to the energumen. It's interesting. Sometimes there'll be sort of a break, and you're asked as laity to just talk to the person, which people don't think about those
Mhm.
breaks. Sometimes they're asked to protect the modesty of the energumen, sometimes to hold them down, um, and really to watch and listen carefully because things tend to happen in the room while you're going through this. There's lots of noises, lots of shadows, lots of things happening that you wouldn't expect. If you think haunted locations on steroids, kind of things happening around you. And these sessions, exorcism sessions, can last hours. Sometimes there's even a break because you're just getting tired. It's really hardly ever, if ever, one and done. So these things, sometimes it takes years and lots of sessions. And in between exorcisms, the energumen are asked to do certain things. They're asked to pray, to go to church, to do penance. They're asked to go for mental health counseling. They're asked to take care of themselves physically and mentally. Eat right, exercise. People are actually asked legitimately, take care of yourselves because the fight is theirs. The fight is not ours as an exorcism team. The fight is on that person. And so they've got to take care of themselves. They've got to stay healthy to do it. Um, Also, family members and friends are called on to help with all of this, to help the person, to help them get better. So, not a simple thing, not an hour and a half movie, usually culminating in a 10 to 15-minute exorcism. But some of those things, with things flying around, that's real.
So we didn't want to just do traditions that are in underneath that Abrahamic faith's umbrella, although I wanted to cover Islam because the tradition is related to Catholicism and related to Christianity, but quite different. I also wanted to talk about something that was very outside of that realm. And so we're going to take a short trip over to Korea and talk about Buddhist exorcism as we close out this episode. So I want to lead with pointing out that there's a ridiculous amount of diversity within Buddhism in particular, which is way beyond the scope of this episode. Just a shameless self plug. If you want to know about Buddhism, there's an episode of Religiously Literate on Buddhism that I highly recommend. We also have episodes on Islam and Christianity, not Catholicism specifically. But if you want to know about Buddhism from like a big 30,000 foot perspective, that's a good place to go. So while exorcism in Korea is not maybe as well known or as out in the open as, say, it is in Catholicism, where it's not to say that it's publicized, but you can go to the movies and see a movie.
But Korea has a large Catholic
Oh
population.
yeah, Korea has a huge Catholic population. But when we talk about Buddhist exorcism, it's not an entirely underground practice, but also at the same time, it's not completely out in the open. There's some interesting conversations about Buddhists in Korea, and this is not just true of Korea, it's also a little bit true in Japan and other places in East Asia, where there is this attempt to sort of distance themselves from the practice itself. And it's not all that different from how Catholicism was there for a hot second before everybody got excited about it in the 80s. It's not as out in the open, I guess, is what I'm going to get at, what I'm saying. So I'm not, so while I did attempt to pronounce things in the Arabic, I am not going to try and pronounce the Korean words because they are really complicated. And like I said, I took a year of Japanese. It's related, but not that closely. So when we talk about exorcism from a Buddhist perspective, and specifically in Korea, the tradition or the practice, it translates as rescuing from illness or saving a life by offering food. Now, there is this really strong tradition in Buddhism, particularly in East Asia and specifically in what's called Pure Land Buddhism, of doing ceremonies and rituals like this to gain what's called merit. And the idea is that when you pass from this existence, if you have accrued enough merit, you will then go on to what's called the Pure Land, where you actually try to attain enlightenment. the very quick Cliff Notes version or explanation of that is this idea that in this life, we've got too much stuff going on that you can't really focus on attaining enlightenment. But what you can do is accrue merit through all these different, avenues. And then when you pass, go on to the Pure Land. And that's all you have to worry about in the Pure Land is you get to hang out and just attain enlightenment and then go on your merry way, right? And so this is one of those examples. And there's parts of this practice that are thought of as sort of accruing merit. So in Korean Buddhism, exorcism is typically performed by monks and nuns. So it's not necessarily someone highly specialized in the practice like we have in Islam and Christianity. Also, in Korea, there's this interesting context where there are people who claim to be or to have these special quote unquote shamanic powers. Now, there's a whole background to that with Korean indigenous religious and spiritual belief that I'm not going to dig into, but I will point you to the episode companion on our Substack where I'm going to talk about K-pop demon hunters and how that's actually legit, how there's a whole bunch of folklore that's behind all of that and actually digs into some of this, but I digress. So in this practice, you have sort of three officiants. You have the Dharma master, which is this monk or nun. You have an auxiliary aide. This is just a helper. You have a certifying Dharma master. This is someone who's like basically granting permission to do the thing. So not all that different from Catholicism.
Yeah,
not all that different. Plus family of the patient. And so that can be one or more people that are there.
This is actually pretty similar. That's very interesting.
It's wild, right? Exactly. And Buddhism does have some sort of legalistic streak to it too, but not quite as, I mean, nobody does it like the Catholics. So some of the causes for possession in this context are very different from what we've just talked about. So first and foremost, it's incorrectly performed funerary rituals for a dead relative. Because the idea is that this possession is sort of akin to ghost sickness, like we talk about in just general in medical anthropology, is this idea that like you've come into contact with someone who's dead, or you have a ghost of someone who is, attacking you and causing this illness or whatever. And so this is particularly true in Buddhism. So after someone passes, a spirit goes on what's described as a 49-day journey to reach its next rebirth. Now, over that 49 days, there are things that have to happen, and they are performed on specific days throughout that period, and then again on the anniversary of that individual's death.
This is pretty legalistic.
It is a little bit, yeah, a little bit. And so if you do any of that wrong, and in each of those ceremonies, there are readings of different sutras and different offerings that are given for the deceased or for your ancestors. And if you do any of those pieces wrong, your deceased relative can end up basically stuck here and will probably be messing with you to get you to correct those problems. And so that's where we get this idea of possession. Now, they can also be caused by attacks during a previous exorcism. So patients are often in this tradition monks, nuns, shamans who perform the ritual themselves. And so they end up with attachments or illnesses because of their involvement.
You actually see that in Catholicism as well.
Oh, I did not know.
That's interesting.
Yeah. And also you can have sort of troublesome ghosts that are sort of not human entities. Now, one thing I'll point out about Buddhism in East Asia in particular is it is almost syncretic. It gets as close to being syncretic without being syncretic as you can, in the sense that a lot of Buddhist practices throughout East Asia incorporate indigenous traditions that were there before Buddhism. And so you'll see that the whole worldview in these traditions is, sort of populated with spirit beings that were already in the region before Buddhism was there. And so you'll have this idea that these spirits can influence you in various ways. Now, in terms of diagnosis, oftentimes you'll have sort of general not feeling well. Headache, fever, loss of appetite, nausea. You'll see this idea of wasting away, things like that.
Ghost sickness.
Ghost sickness, 100%. Yes, exactly. And this, in combination with the recent passing of someone close to you, typically indicates or could indicate that you are a victim of possession or ghost sickness, right? And so it's a lot more simple to diagnose in this tradition. It's like, well, did someone die recently? Well, you must have screwed something up in those 49 days. So,
And chances are everybody screwed something up.
yeah, because it's 49 days worth of stuff you got to do.
Yeah.
Yeah. When we talk about treatment in this tradition, it is glaringly similar to Catholicism in that there are ritual manuals in Buddhism. And this is true outside of exorcism. This is true across the tradition. You see them for all kinds of things. There is one that is my personal favorite. It's called the Rite for Releasing Living Creatures. And the idea is that you gather up these animals. They can be turtles are popular, birds are popular, fish are popular. You read them certain sutras and you essentially convert them to Buddhism and then release them. And it's actually a huge ecological problem in East Asia because they use invasive species a lot of time. And fun fact for you today, snakeheads in the United States, the reason we have them is because of that. So these are really common, and there's a ritual manual for basically every single ritual you'd ever need in Buddhism. Now, that doesn't mean that they're all the same. So there are several versions of the text in particular where it's related to exorcism. This is true. And interestingly, none are believed to be more authoritative than the other. So you can basically use whichever one you want. It's kind of, choose your own adventure sort of thing. But the oldest that we have is from the Chosun period, which is from 1392 to 1897, which I understand is like 500 years.
Yeah, I'd say that's a very long
long period. Yeah. Right. There are different manuals. There is a lot of variation regionally and between individual practitioners, including deletions, insertions, and all other manner of modifications that people might do, which I don't think Catholics are deleting things out of the rite.
Not typically.
We're just adding stuff. We're adding stuff on.
Add things, yes.
Yeah. Now, this is in a category of rituals that are called food offering rituals, and these are mostly related to funerals, and is usually, the exorcism itself is usually preceded by what's called a sending on the spirits or a mass for the dead. This is all related into ideas of ancestors and how someone transitions from this life to the next. Now, the Dharma Master's role is to perform specific hand gestures or mudras. So if you've ever seen depictions of the Buddha or other Buddhist figures, bodhisattvas and all of that, and they have their hands in specific postures or gestures, those are called mudras. Those actually have important meaning. Catholics even have their one that they do, but we won't even get into that.
Couple.
Yeah, so we won't even get into that. You guys are,
a couple of
everyone's all the same. All the spooky stuff that possesses you, you just need to find the version you like. No.
That's right.
So they do this. They also recite mantras and visualize the actions of the spirits as they're moving through the ritual. And mantras in particular are meant to kind of help the master maintain control and subdue the spirits throughout. Now, typically they're performed at night after 10 p.m. They're performed in the Dharma hall of a monastery. It's kind of similar to a nave, sanctuary, and an auditorium in a Christian church. It's kind of like a combo.
Is there a reason for after 10 p.m.?
Not that I could find. I didn't really find much about that. I don't know if that's because we are practicing this somewhat underground, but not underground, or if it's just like spooky stuff comes out at night, and so we need to deal with it at night.
Some reason like you wanted it to be very dark.
I didn't find anything about that. It's also a private practice, which is very different from other Buddhist rituals. So if you're doing, for example, if you're doing the Rite for Releasing Living Creatures, that is widely publicized. And people show up with their animals that they bought at the market that they want you to convert so that they can gain merit. And so it's very outside of the norm in that sense. So at the beginning of this ritual, it starts with kind of an ablution or a cleansing to cleanse bad karma and defilements, not from the patient or the patient's family or anyone else that's there, but from the spirits themselves. They actually, as part of the ritual, simulate a Korean public bath in that space. And so they build basically a screen that has men's and women's bathroom signs and then paper clothing. That this tradition of burning paper clothing is a holdover from China and Chinese Buddhism. And they're burned behind this folding screen as a sort of offering to the spirits. And the idea is they get burnt, they go into the spirit world, and then the spirits have those clothes. And so the troublesome spirit or spirits are bathed, they're clothed through the recitation of mantras, and then they have what's called a spirit tablet, which is brought to the family members as kind of a representation of those spirits, and it's taken before the Buddha's altar inside the Dharma hall. Now, they also set up a whole spirit altar with a whole bunch of various offerings, including lots of these joss paper offerings. That's what they're called. And these are paper representations of all kinds of different things. You name it, you can get joss paper of it. And they're burnt as offerings to the dead. If you've ever seen any of the Hungry Ghost festivals in East Asia, people burning stuff, this is usually what they're burning. The actual layout and interpretation of these altars varies a lot between officiants. There's really no directions in any of the manuals. They're more about the sort of the readings and things that you're like gestures and things that you're supposed to do. There are specifically oftentimes paper representations of horses, though, and these are thought to be either vehicles to carry troublesome spirits to the Pure Land or the underworld, or a horse-headed manifestation of Avalokiteshvara, who is the primary bodhisattva in Pure Land Buddhism that is thought to subdue demons. Now, it can be broken up into a recitation of 4 sets of 4 mantras and a lengthy dharani. The first opens the hells for the troublesome spirits so they can come into the ritual space. That is definitely not something happening in Catholic exorcism. The second is to prepare the food to make it edible for the spirits. And the third, the spirits are fed.
I wish the food was kind of part.
Food is, everybody's all about that food in Asia.
Like they're about fasting.
Yeah, right. Yeah, for real. This is like the absolute opposite of that.
Yeah.
Everybody's getting fed over here. And then the fourth sends off the spirits by burning their paper effigies. So that's one thing that's also common of that altar is there are effigies of these spirits that are then burned. And they're passed on with a wish for them to have a good rebirth in the Pure Land. So it's kind of similar in Islam, this idea of, converting jinn to Islam. And then the final step violently and forcefully sends spirits who refuse to previously leave. So like we give you all these opportunities, like you have all these opportunities. We're going to feed you. We're going to clothe you. We're going to say, hey, have a nice life. And if you still don't leave, then we have this special piece where we have different recitations and what can include the throwing of red beans at the altar and the patient. And this, what's interesting about the red beans here, it seems really random, right? The red bean throwing is a holdover from traditional Korean shamanism. And so there are some, part of the reason why this is somewhat an underground practice is because of that overlap with Korean shamanism and the sort of general. There's some folks in Korea who are doing the things that Catholic priests were doing or not priests were doing, where they were sort of taking advantage of people.
Right.
And there is kind of a strain in exorcism and Buddhist exorcism in Korea of these sort of self-proclaimed shamans sort of taking advantage of people. And so that's part of where that comes from. But the red bean thing actually comes from older stuff in Korea. Now, we're talking about spirits that are important throughout this process, kind of not that dissimilar from Catholicism. Avalokiteshvara is the primary bodhisattva in Pure Land Buddhism and is thought to play a key role throughout the exorcism. Fun fact, when Catholic missionaries came to Asia, Avalokiteshvara was the one that they pointed to and tried to say, that's the Virgin Mary over here.
Really?
Yes.
Is that a female?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
She plays a key role throughout the exorcism. She kind of meditates on the conflict between the human and the spirit worlds, and then ideally escorts the spirits to their appropriate rebirth after you're done. And interestingly, descriptions of patient responses to the ritual itself are not all that different from what you'd expect from a Catholic exorcism. So the sudden outbursts, violent behaviors, things like that.
That seems to be cross-cultural, even beyond the ones we've talked about, but just the way a person responds.
Right. And so I think, I've been thinking a lot about like why we wanted to do the exorcism episode in general, apart from your experiences and what I know of those experiences.
They didn't talk that much.
We didn't really talk that much about it.
We have to do that at some point.
Yeah, we probably should. I think it's in the paranormal world, if you watch any of the reality shows, there's lots of stuff getting thrown around about demons. There's a demon here. There's a demon portal. This is possessed. This is object.
Lots of things being thrown around saying we're going to exorcise
this.
And
I think it's really, I think we lose a lot in those conversations about, because we just kind of use this generic Christian like veneer over that idea of demons. And we lose a lot of like the interesting context. I mean, I'm a cultural anthropologist. All I care about is context. That's my whole life. But we just explained, how Islam and Catholicism and Korean Buddhism are very different, although similar. And I think it's really important for us when we think about the paranormal not to reduce everything down to like this generic idea of what these things are, right? If we're talking about demons or possession from a Buddhist perspective, it could be your grandma, not some like
But at that point, would it
demon.
really be considered a demon? It's an ancestor, is it?
And that's what I mean,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
So like I think, we when we talk about possession, we have like this very
yeah.
particular idea in our head of what it looks like, and usually it involves a guy with a collar and a purple sleeve.
Saying it comes from Hollywood,
Yeah,
originally
100%.
movies, but honestly, a lot of the paranormal TV
Yeah, the
shows
paranormal
did.
TV shows play into it a lot too, right? And even when they get away from the Catholic stuff and we get into the sort of generic Protestant exorcist practices and stuff, those all still rely very heavily on Catholic
Catholic
perspectives.
light,
Yeah,
in
kind
a
of.
lot of ways.
Yeah, yeah. And like, and not to say that disparagingly, like they just rely on that imagery and that approach and the
Right.
assumptions that people have about them. And I think, that's one of the things that we are really trying to do on this podcast is like highlight those parts of the paranormal community that some people miss, I think. And like, there's so much interesting stuff in all of this that, when it gets lost on, one random dude in an affliction shirt talking about demonic portals in a basement somewhere,
Are you referring to anybody?
No, no, not at all. No one I know, no one I have met personally. But I think it's really important that we don't ignore that stuff and that we pay attention to those things. Because also, like, say, for example, for the paranormal researchers that listen, say you encounter someone who's having these kinds of experiences, where do you point them to?
Yeah,
And
and
it should go beyond like what their religious background is.
it shouldn't be just anyone who's out ghost hunting.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
Because, some of this stuff can get dangerous,
Right.
and there's things you have to do
Right.
to try to deal with it. From my perspective, part of the importance of this episode was to really focus on the healing aspect.
Yeah, that too. Yeah.
And, the healing is done in slightly different ways, but it's there in every single example
Yeah,
of
it
exorcism.
is.
We see that.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah, everybody's, and I mean, you don't even have to look past the like, have to think, okay, well, spiritual illness is a thing. Like
right,
everybody talks about like physical illness throughout
right.
all of these traditions. Thanks for joining us on Beyond the Human, where the strange, the supernatural, and the deeply human collide. If today's journey into the unknown sparked your curiosity, we'd love for you to subscribe, leave a review, and share the show with fellow seekers of the extraordinary.
Have a story, question, or theory of your own? Reach out. We want to hear how the paranormal shapes your world, too. You can find us online at Patreon, Facebook, and Instagram.
Until next time, stay curious, stay critical, and keep thinking beyond the human.